I have a bit more to talk about. Extrapolating the video by Bo Lotto, Thriving in Uncertain Times. And he says, you are seeing the meaning of the information, not the information itself. And to me, this is important in terms of how they program us to translate the meaning of the information or our experiences into the framework of mental illness. So we're not seeing the raw data of our experience. We're seeing it in terms of this is a symptom, or this is this, or this means I have to call my doctor. And we can't be in direct contact with that information when we're translating in terms of mental illness, when we're thinking that we need to do something about it. Maybe that state and that energy is doing something about something else. So this is what I hijacked in self-dialogue. This is what I hacked, is being in contact with that information and making up my own meaning and context, not thinking in terms of this means it's mental illness. This means I don't know, maybe this, maybe that, I think this, I read that, I saw this, I experienced this, and always going with that. So none of the energy gets translated into fear, because the thoughts that it's related to mental illness are fear. And it channels part of that energy into fearing it. And when part of the energy is channeled into fearing it, we're not curious about it, we're not wondering about it, we're not making meaning out of it, we're just fearing it. I make so much meaning out of the information, out of the experience, out of the perceptions, that those meanings related to mental illness can't come in and prevent me from making meaning, from creating perception. Because fearing that it could have something to do with mental illness creates that as the perception, and now I can't be in contact with the meaning of the perception that I might be able to create otherwise. If I want to go to the hospital, I can make those meanings, because channeling some of the energy into making mental illness meanings will slowly change my trajectory to being in the hospital, to being in front of a psychiatrist, to being on more medications, to changing my medications. Whereas by participating in this self-dialogue with myself for the last year, I've moved out of taking medications and I haven't been in the hospital. What could all these meanings really mean? And maybe it doesn't mean anything else except pointing to that we can make meaning. And we can hold on to the meanings we've been given by others, or we can make our own meaning and context. And what happens when we take others' meanings, and what happens when we create our own? And I wonder if the map consciousness is the process of draining us of all old meanings and seeing the process of creative perception and making meanings. And it's quite chaotic. But as we make meaning in daily life, do we need to go into a hyper-meaningful state to rid us of all past meanings and see that we can make meaning? Or can we make meaning in daily life as embodied humans and not really appear any differently than anyone else if we are making meaning on a daily basis? And I feel like that's a really important part of Harvest Practice and Body, is to make one's own meanings on a daily basis. Because the process of map consciousness comes in and makes us make meaning, makes us make more meaning. We're more in touch with way more meaning. But if we can make a little bit of meaning every day, maybe the brain is happy with that. Maybe the brain is a meaning-making organ. And when we're not making meaning, but having old meanings ruminating in our head, the brain, that's not what it's designed for. So by moving in alignment with what the brain is designed for, perhaps it doesn't need these really strong experiences. And isn't that one of the reasons why people take substances, is to feel more meaning or to feel detached from all of one's history? So if one can make meaning, maybe that makes that default mode network of repeating stories in history go down, because meaning and the fact that we can make meaning becomes salient. And that's what map consciousness does. It makes it very salient that there's meaning and we can make meaning, we can see meaning, we can act on meaning, we can behave and synchronize with meaning. And he talks about something at the 16-minute mark that's difficult to explain in terms of the way I want to extrapolate it. He shows a picture of a sharp-edged object and then a rounded blob-like object, and he says, which one's Kiki and which one's Boo Boo? And he says 99% of people call the sharp one Kiki and the round one Boo Boo, because Boo Boo is a rounded sound and Kiki is a sharp sound. So he says people don't even know that they're doing this. So there's no real free will in us choosing which one is which. It's conditioned that we feel like a sharp sound is related to a sharp object. So we'll attribute it to that. Now this is where the tricky part comes in. He says we don't know we're doing this. So imagine if I'm sitting in front of a psychiatrist and they say, well, why did you say that? And I might say, well, I said that mean thing because there was a sharp object in the corner. So sharp object, in map consciousness, I might look at a sharp object and say something mean. So what I'm trying to say is people who have a mental illness label might sometimes say things like, I did this because of that. And the this and that to the psychiatrist doesn't sound at all congruent. It just sounds crazy. But I feel like sometimes we're trying to give voice to some of these invisible ways we're conditioned, and in that space of altered consciousness, we're aware of those underlying fundamental conditionings, but we don't know how to give voice to it. So in the example of pointing out Kiki and Boo Boo, Bo Lotto then explains, well, you said this is Boo Boo because the sound is rounded and the shape is rounded. So somebody might do something because of a rounded sound, for example, and they're trying to give voice to it. Like, I did that nice thing because there was a circle there. You know, and a circle might, in our subconscious, apply to, say, wholeness and things like that. So what I'm trying to say is we get in touch with some of these invisible algorithms and we're attempting to give voice to them. Yet, people who act so-called normally aren't asked to explain their behavior. But if we're in a space that we're behaving apparently oddly, I feel like it's because we can see some of these invisible things and then we try to explain and give voice to them and it sounds odd. So somebody points out that the rounded one is Boo Boo, they might just say, well, it looks like Boo Boo. And then a neuroscientist comes around and says, well, your brain is conditioned to attribute rounded sounds to rounded objects. I'm not explaining this very well, but I feel like we get in touch with some of these underlying algorithms that are invisible, and by trying to explain them, we sound crazy. And we don't even know that we're explaining them, but we're actually aware of reasons why we're doing things, but they're part of the conditioned program. So when we explain conditioned programs, it sounds weird, and especially if someone's looking at us as if that's us. So can we try to figure out why we do things and decouple from that conditioning? All that invisible stuff. And in those states, a lot of the invisible conditioning is visible, and we're trying to figure out how to resolve it, how to get away from it, how to not move in that sphere. And then we look bizarre, and then we have to explain things to people, and we might say that we ran away from a person because their face was mad or something. And that's a reasonable thing to do if we're really perceptive. We can read people's body language and things, and we're more sensitive. So Bo Lotto is explaining that there's no free will. So something else I want to extrapolate from the video is that Bo says, how is it possible to see differently? It begins with a question. What's next is based on your assumptions, your space of possibility. And I've talked about how in MAP, we have very few assumptions, so we have a large space of possibility. And MAP consciousness also erases and suspends a lot of our history, thus erases our assumptions and increases our range of the next likely possible. So when our assumptions, which are part of our history, are partly erased, this shows up sometimes in how we can think that we created something that we didn't, or that we're famous, or we know somebody famous, because it feels possible, or that we're related to somebody that we're not. So this shows that the process of MAP consciousness is messing with our history. And since our whole world is designed around relating based on sharing our history and our stories, that as soon as our story gets messed up, it's difficult to relate to the world. But why is relating based on our stories the most fundamental thing? Why are we just all a bunch of walking storybooks? So messing with our history and our story and not feeling our story and not living in our story actually increases our next most likely possible. Because if we're walking around feeling like each time we meet someone we have to share our story and our history, we're just reinforcing that, and we're not as much moving in the space of possibility. So MAP consciousness messes with our default mode network, and by doing that it increases the salience network. When we're not sure about our story, we need to find new meaning. And Bo Lotto says that our assumptions are ingrained in our brain, while MAP consciousness de-ingrains our assumptions from our brain, or suspends them, much like a psychedelic would do. And our assumptions create our pattern of behavior. So I feel like if the universe comes in with this energy and de-ingrains our assumptions from our brain, so we have more meaning in life and we see other things as possible, it's in a way helping us to redesign our life, see what else is possible for our life. It's a blueprint visionary state that can inform the rest of our life. And it does take some integrating after. It's very disorienting, but it's not seen that way. It's seen as a mental illness and we need to take drugs forever. MAP consciousness is a quantum drop in assumptions without having to think about and see the assumptions in a slow, stepwise process in order to question them. It drops the very questioner. There's no questioner. Everything is approached in the questioning state, in the state of wonder, not in the state of knowing, which is the self and its knowledge. So the quantum isn't a leap, but a drop in assumptions. It's a quantum drop. And this energetic movement of the universe makes the ego very unstable. It makes it ill in a way because its very foundation is wobbly. And Bo Lotto mentions that we only love uncertainty in the context of play. So MAP consciousness is a movement of play of the universe because we're in uncertainty in that state. And perhaps it's difficult for us to play that game of the universe indefinitely. And we fall back into playing the games of the ego. And he said it's a way of being defined by celebrating uncertainty. Maybe MAP consciousness is a way of being that is celebrating uncertainty. And he said play is intrinsically motivated. Maybe play with the universe can be intrinsically motivated. The reason is to play with the universe, not any of the human ego reasons that we've created for life. MAP consciousness is the universe playing with us and us stepping into uncertainty. And Bo Lotto mentioned that what defines a great leader is how you lead others into uncertainty. And he said, lead by example, admit mistakes, and see quality in others. And I wonder if I'm leading others into the uncertainty of making meaning for oneself and not relying on the certain meanings of mental illness. Because the uncertainty of making one's own meanings could be rich, it could be a lot better, and it could be what makes us partly better. So can we make our own meaning and context out of these diverse, creative, perceptual experiences? This happens when volition drops. And what makes volition drop? That's uncertain. That's uncertainty itself.